The Incas by Nigel Davies. Chapter 8. The Decline and Fall. The Rival Contenders. With the death of Huayna Capac, the period of Inca achievement moved toward its close. The events of both the Civil War and the Conquest need to be briefly considered in any attempt to assess this achievement, and in particular to understand how the mighty structure of Tawantinsuyu could suffer such a dramatic collapse. The first portentous event was the Civil War, which arose on the death of Huayna Capac. Such discord was not wholly without precedent, given the absence of precise rules governing the succession to the throne. In this instance, the Inca hierarchy was reluctant to accept without question the deceased ruler's choice of successor. According to Sarmiento, Huayna Capac declared on his deathbed to the leading Orejones, including close relatives, that his first choice as heir was his son, Ninan Cuyochi. However, if the omens were not favorable to him, he would accept another son, Huascar, as successor. The entrails of two llamas were examined by the high priest of the sun. The omens for Cuyochi were most unpropitious, and Huascar was thus proclaimed the 12th Inca. Ninan Cuyochi died of smallpox soon after this. Huascar was duly enthroned in Cusco, escorted, according to Cieza, by no less than 40 brothers. He appointed as his captain general or second person a prince named Atoko. A deep rivalry, however, prevailed between Huascar and another brother, Atahualpa, usually described as an illegitimate offspring, though his mother, Paloca, was reportedly descended from Pachacutec. Atahualpa remained in Tumebamba, but numerous Orejones who accompanied Huayna Capac's body to Cusco were accused of supporting Atahualpa as a rival Inca, and, on Huascar's orders, killed. These Orejones were all from Hanan Cusco, as was Atahualpa himself, whereas Huascar was from Urin. Atahualpa had apparently not yet made a formal claim to the throne of his father. Accordingly, he sent further supporters with conciliatory messages to Huascar, but these individuals were also killed. According to Santa Cruz Pachacuti, at this stage, Atahualpa merely asked to be confirmed as governor of Quito. The chronicler relates that Huascar had the skins of most of his brother's envoys made into drums, but sent a few back to Tumebamba with insulting messages to their master, together with bundles of female attire. Cabello's detailed account of the Civil War diverges in certain respects from that of Sarmiento. He mentions Huayna Capac's great affection for Ninan Cuyochi, whose premature death left Huascar as the natural heir. Cabello confirms the murder of the Orejones who accompanied Huayna Capac's body to Cusco, but states that Atahualpa's subsequent emissaries, after conferring with Huascar and with his wife and mother, were allowed to return to Tumebamba bearing conciliatory messages. Nonetheless, after their departure, a Cañari leader convinced Huascar that Atahualpa planned to usurp the throne. Following this episode, Huascar, persuaded that Atahualpa would eventually rebel if allowed to remain in Ecuador, sent 3 successive envoys to his rival. Atahualpa was commanded to be present himself in Cusco and warned that if he failed to obey the summons, an army would be sent to fetch him. The first to take up arms was Huascar. Cabello, Sarmiento, and Cobo describe a rather involved conflict in which Huascar initially triumphed. Atoko, Huascar's general, advanced northward and apparently succeeded in occupying Tumebamba. With the aid of his Cañari supporters, Atoko captured Atahualpa, but the latter miraculously escaped from his prison, according to one account by drilling a hole in a wall with a silver bar given to him by an important lady who had been allowed to visit him. The Spaniards, alas, were to prove themselves more efficient as captors. Following his liberation, Atahualpa assembled a large force, which eventually defeated at Cusco and Ambato, south of Quito. Atoko and many of his men were killed. Atahualpa's army then marched southward under the command of 2 loyal captains, Chacochima and Quisquis. and fought a series of engagements with forces commanded by Huascar's brother Huanca, including the battles of Chaucha and Bonbon. As Atahualpa's armies approached Cusco, Huascar entered the field in person. He mobilized a huge force, drawing upon his supporters from the principal provinces of the empire, including Colas, Charcas, and even Chile. After an initial triumph near Cotapampa, in which Atahualpa suffered huge losses, the fortunes of the war were reversed, and Huascar himself was captured by Chalcochima and Quisquis. These accounts are confirmed in broad outline by that of Betanzos, who offers an abundance of seemingly factual material to which he adds details that are more allegorical. He is an implacably harsh critic of Huascar. In the very first chapters of his story of the Civil War, he writes of the drunken and licentious behavior of the newly crowned ruler, together with his profanity in despoiling the former rulers' panacas of their lands. Betanzos also describes his cruelty in torturing Atahualpa's emissaries. More addicted to the bottle than to the din of battle, Huascar fell from power on a tragic note. Awakened from his drunken slumbers at midday by his captain, Aguapante, and warned that Atahualpa's generals, Quisquis and Chalcochima, were approaching Cusco, Huascar precipitously set forth with a large army to stem their advance. But then he devised a stratagem so inept that it failed to deceive those seasoned commanders and instead led to his capture. Betanzos is scarcely more flattering when writing of Atahualpa, his own father-in-law, whose atrocities he also describes in detail. As an example, perhaps apocryphal, of such barbarity, he relates that on Atahualpa's orders, the hearts were cut out from the living bodies of 3 Cañari chiefs, chopped into very small pieces, and eaten raw. To an account of Atahualpa's deeds, in some respects more factual, he adds another bizarre incidents, such as the upstart Inca's consultation of a famous stone oracle, or Huaca, in the vicinity of Huamachuco. He was tersely told by the Huaca that the god Viracocha disapproved of his wanton killings. Not content with beheading the Huaca with an axe, as a result of which the old man inside the Huaca also lost his head, in his rage he determined to level the hill on which the idol had stood. Surviving accounts stress the gruesome ferocity of the Civil War and the huge toll of casualties inflicted in a whole series of battles. Not surprisingly, the victor's vengeance was pitiless, leading at times to extremes of both cruelty and vandalism. According to Huaman Poma, Huascar, when in captivity, was fed a diet consisting of the excrement of humans and dogs. In place of chicha, he was forced to drink the urine of llamas. Because of Huascar's association with his grandfather, Tupac Inca, the men and women of Tupac's Panaca were slaughtered, and this ruler's own mummy was burned to cinders, an act of sacrilege so horrendous as to be unthinkable in more settled times. Huascar himself was forced to witness such abominations in person, including the killing of 80 of his own children. Adherents to his cause throughout the empires, such as the Cañaris, were also butchered. The forces of Atahualpa, the descendant of Pachacutec, even pillaged the shrines of the holy city of Cusco. Relating the fluctuating fortunes of the rival contenders in more detail can add very little to our understanding of the inner workings of the Inca Empire. Nonetheless, certain aspects of the conflict are perhaps revealing and relevant. Among the more curious of these, belying the traditional image of the Inca ruler as the resplendent supreme warrior, is the apparent reluctance of the 2 claimants to the throne to take the field at the head of their armies. Huascar only fought in the last and most disastrous battle of all. Atahualpa merely dallied in the north, entrusting to his leading generals that forces that won the war, occupied Cusco, and exacted a merciless revenge. The apparent absence of both Huascar and Atahualpa from the main battles that were to decide their fate might seem surprising, though the tendency was perhaps increasing for the ruler to delegate military command to others. Such a tendency was to a certain degree unavoidable because of the vast extent of the empire, in which several major campaigns might be in progress at the same time. Such operations were not always reported by the chroniclers, who nonetheless do at times refer to forces sent by the emperor to specific regions to make new conquests or to suppress uprisings. The accounts of the Civil War also draw attention to the process whereby a new Inca ruler acceded to the throne, a sequence of almost Byzantine complexity. Huascar is more often described as the quote-unquote legitimate successor, and thereby as enjoying a certain consensual support. However, he is also generally portrayed as fecklessly cruel and debauched, an image somewhat at variance with the principle of choosing the quote-unquote fittest son as heir to the throne. Huascar's rival, Atahualpa, was the confirmed favorite of the armies of the north, who had fought so hard for Huayna Capac and who thereafter proved themselves to be the strongest force in the empire. But Atahualpa hardly seems to have owed this loyalty to any reputation as a genial commander. On the contrary, according to Sarmiento, he was out of favor with his father at the time of his death because of his dismal failure as leader of a force sent against the Pastos. Betanzos, though differing in certain details, tells of a similar tale of this event, recounting how Atahualpa fled from the field of battle, followed by his large force. His enraged father tore his clothes, expostulating that an army of women would have given a better account of themselves. Such reports not only stress the complexity of the process of succession, but also draw attention to the latent rivalry that seems to have persisted between Hurin and Hanan Cusco. The sources tend to identify Huascar's lineage with Hurin Cusco. Sarmiento even writes of the extreme animosity or aborrecimiento of those Hanan Cusco towards Huascar. Betanzos explains the problem in somewhat different terms, citing a statement by Huascar that his lineage also derived from Hanan, but that such was his hatred of Atahualpa, heir to the strictly Hanan identity of Pachacutec, that he henceforth would owe allegiance to a recreated lineage of Hurin. The sources generally give the impression that, at least since the time of Pachacutec, Hanan Cusco, identified to a marked degree with the army, came to enjoy a certain primacy over Hurin Cusco, mainly associated with the established priestly hierarchy of Coricancha. Hence, the elevation of Huascar to the throne might conceivably be viewed as a kind of counter-revolution on the part of this conservative religious hierarchy, based in Hurin, against the Hanan military establishment, in particular against Huayna Capac's Great Northern Army. Huascar, the protagonist of Hurin, unquestionably enjoyed very wide support, not only in Cusco but throughout much of the empire, from many parts of which he freely recruited ample forces for his army. Even the north was divided in its allegiance, as the formidable Cañaris were among Huascar's staunchest allies. Such loyalties and associations need to be borne in mind in weighing the true balance of forces in the Inca realm at the time of its destruction. Certain aspects of the Civil War suggest that the more traditional and conservative forces of Hurin had perhaps not wholly succumbed to Pachacutec's reforms. It might also be added that Spanish sources, obsessed with the notions of primogeniture, perhaps exaggerated the strength of the provincial support for the quote-unquote legitimate successor, although these writers freely admit that Huascar's treatment of his own supporters finally served to alienate them. Rostropowski, citing various chroniclers, concludes that the accounts of the respective lineages of the two claimants are ambiguous enough to suggest that it was more a war of opposing cliques than a struggle between rival houses. As she points out, Ciesa maintained that Atahualpa, as well as Huascar, was connected on his mother's side with Hurin Cusco. However, Betanzos, as we have seen, refers to Huascar as speaking of his Anan lineage. Pease describes the struggle as fomented by the Cusco ruling's establishments inherent resentment of the political ascendancy of the Tumebamba military coterie, established during the reign of Huayna Cápac. This ascendancy, endowing Tumebamba with the status of a rival quote-unquote center of the world, created a grave situation for the Cusco religious hierarchy. Hence, the outbreak of war might be attributed to the quest for vengeance by this group, motivated by mystical religious necessity to restore its supremacy. A short-lived triumph. If Atahualpa's victory was total, it was short-lived. In the spring of 1532, at the very moment he was celebrating the news of the Battle of Cotapampa and the capture of Huascar, he received in Humachuco the portentous tidings of the landing of Pizarro's small force of Spaniards. Having savagely crushed the resistance of the islanders of Puna, they had crossed the Gulf in Guayaquil and stormed the city of Tumbes in a night attack. The Civil War, which had spread to almost every corner of the Inca realm, also left its mark upon this region, never fully incorporated into the empire. When Hernando de Soto rode inland from Tumbes to Cajas, he found the town in ruins, and from the trees hung many bodies of Indians loyal to Huascar, who had refused to surrender to the victorious Atahualpa. Francisco Pizarro was by now no stranger to the Ecuadorian littoral. His first voyage in 1524 had achieved little. A second expedition to Ecuador in 1527 or 1528 made a few discoveries but sustained heavy casualties. In 1530, he set sail once more from Seville with a flotilla manned by would-be conquistadors. After a wearisome march along the coast of Ecuador, ending in the occupation of Puna, he eventually reached Tumbes. At the head of an exiguous force of 62 horsemen and 106 foot soldiers, Pizarro then set forth on his march into the interior on September 24, 1532. Atahualpa's first envoy, sent from Cajamarca, soon located the Spaniards, and after a 2-day stay in their midst, invited Pizarro to proceed to Cajamarca to meet Atahualpa. Pizarro readily accepted and sent the Inca the gift of a fine Holland shirt and 2 goblets of Venetian glass. The eyewitness account by Miguel de Estete, a European, of the first face-to-face meeting confirms all that the chroniclers' informants related to the pomp and ceremony surrounding an Inca ruler. In a very fine litter with the ends of its timbers covered in silver, came the figure of Atahualpa. 80 lords carried him on their shoulders, all wearing a very rich blue livery. His own person was very richly dressed, with his crown on his head and a collar of large emeralds round his neck. He was seated on the litter, on a small stool with a rich saddle cushion. He stopped when he reached the middle of the square of Cajamarca, with his body half exposed. The litter was lined with parrot feathers of many colors, and embellished with plates of gold and silver. Behind it came 2 other litters and 2 hammocks in which other leading persons traveled. Then came many men in squadrons with headdresses of gold and silver. This formal entry into Cajamarca followed Atahualpa's decision to convert his visit to the exotic strangers, now themselves ensconced in the town, into a kind of ceremonial pageant. He was accompanied by a large escort, unarmed according to major sources, except for small battle axes and slings concealed beneath their tunics. The anonymous French account of the conquest does state that many of Atahualpa's men bore heavy clubs hanging from their belts, and that others were armed with bows and arrows. What then occurred is familiar to every student of the Spanish conquest. Though the chroniclers may vary in certain details, they concur as to the principal events: the capture of the Inca, the carnage that followed mainly outside the walls of Cajamarca, leaving 6,000 or 7,000 Indians dead on the plain, the offer of a room full of gold as the Inca's ransom, an unexpected proposal that astounded the Spanish captors, the killing of Huascar on Atahualpa's orders, the melting down of countless masterpieces of the Inca goldsmiths, yielding a total of 13,420 pounds of 22.5 karat gold. The judicial murder of Atahualpa, strangled after he had solemnly embraced the gentle faith of his conquerors. And finally, the Spanish march on Cusco. By killing Atahualpa, the Spaniards had cast themselves into Indian eyes in the role of champions of the cause of Huascar. As such, they had to face the implacable resistance of Atahualpa's northern armies, commanded by his general Quisquis, at that moment in occupation of much of central Peru. Against these forces, the Spanish fought no less than 4 battles. After the final, conclusive encounter in the mountains above Cusco, Niquitans lost heart, and Quisquis' army simply vanished. The triumphant conquistadors, when they first beheld Cusco, described the buildings of the Inca capital, as their counterparts had done in Mexico, as superior to anything they had ever seen in Spain. The finest hour. A few episodes from the early years of Spanish occupation may be relevant to our study and shed some light on the socio-political structure of Tawantinsuyu itself. After the deaths of Atahualpa and Huascar, the Spaniards already controlled the central part of the Inca Empire, roughly corresponding to modern Peru, and were in the process of occupying Bolivia and Chile. But the northern army still held out against the invaders in Ecuador. These forces were now ruled with a very firm hand by Rumiñahui, Atahualpa's third-ranking general, acting more as an independent condottiere than the trusted lieutenant of the dead ruler and his heirs. During his master's captivity, Rumiñahui held the ruler's sons and many of his women in custody. Atahualpa managed to send his brother in an attempt to rescue his children, but the prince was murdered by Rumiñahui, skinned, and made into a drum. The Spaniards' attention was naturally drawn to this northern stronghold and its ruthless tyrant. Accordingly, Sebastián de Benalcázar set out from the port of San Miguel de Piura, about 120 miles south of Tumbes. John Hemming, in his account of the conquest, describes the opposition Benalcázar encountered as the finest hour of the Inca army. Though the Khitan forces had no prince of the blood to lead them, their resistance was staunch. Benalcázar occupied Tumebamba, where 3,000 Cañaris, still loyal to the cause of Huascar, joined his forces. The Spanish general continued his northward march, and at Teocajas, situated near a mountain pass at an altitude of 14,000 feet, met ferocious resistance. This was the greatest pitched battle of the conquest. Though the Inca force failed to stem the Spanish horsemen, the latter achieved no decisive victory. The Spaniards had to continue to fight bands of natives until they eventually reached Quito. Finding that all the men of this principality had left to join the Inca forces, Benalcázar sought to make an example by slaughtering their women and children. Meanwhile, other contenders had unexpectedly entered the field. The well-known conquistador of Mexico, Pedro de Alvarado, proceeding from Guatemala, had landed a powerful force on the coast of Ecuador in February 1534. However, unfamiliar with the harsh conditions of the Andes, he and his expedition initially achieved little, and thereafter many of his men and horses froze to death as he tried to penetrate the Cordillera and took the wrong route. The Inca forces faced their own struggles. Quisquis, Atahualpa's trusted general, having fought inconclusive battles against the Spaniards in the region of Chaucha, returned to Ecuador. He failed to join forces with Rumiñahui. After both generals had been defeated and killed, the Ecuadorian resistance gradually subsided. The occupation of the southernmost marches of the empire presented fewer problems. In July 1535, Diego de Almagro left Cusco for Chile at the head of a well-equipped army, supported by great trains of native porters and accompanied by a force of 12,000 men, under the command of Paulu, another surviving son of Huayna Capac. The march through Colao and Charcas met with scant resistance. Both provinces tended to accept the authority of Paulu and demonstrated their loyalty to the latter as heir to Huayna Capac. In Chile, there was some resistance, and isolated groups of Spaniards were ambushed and killed. In the province of Copiapo, most of the Indians simply fled from the invaders, puppets and rebels. Meanwhile, however, an entirely new situation had arisen in the capital. The stories of the Spaniards' dealings with a series of phantom Inca kings constitutes a bizarre page in history, though its details hardly fall within the scope of this work. The first attempt to maintain the fiction of a subservient quote-unquote empire was short-lived. Immediately after the Christian burial of Atahualpa, elaborate preparations began in Cajamarca for the coronation of Huascar's younger brother, Tupac Hualpa. Every detail of the traditional ceremonies was punctiliously observed, commencing with a 3-day fast of the emperor in a specially constructed edifice, and ending with the placing of the royal fringe on his head, as his followers turned their faces toward the sun. The reign of this compliant puppet came to a most untimely end when the Inca died a few months later, in October 1533, while staying in Chaucha in the company of Francisco Pizarro. The Spaniards, chagrined by their loss, convinced themselves that Tupac had been poisoned. Undaunted by this setback and determined to maintain the fiction of Inca rule, the conquistadors were not slow to seek a new champion for their cause. On entering Cusco in November 1533, they were greeted by the young Manco, yet another son of Huayna Capac, who impressed them by his obsequious devotion to Spanish rule. Manco was duly crowned and regaled with the same ceremonies previously observed for the coronation of his half-brother, Tupac Hualpa. Miguel de Estete offers a vivid description of Manco's coronation, at which the Spanish witnessed all the panoply of Inca ritual, including the presence of mummies of the former kings seated on thrones. The new Inca led the procession, flanked by the mortal remains of his father, Huayna Capac. The mummies were attended by numerous members of their panacas, both male and female, holding fans and showing reverence for the former monarchs as if they were still living. De Estete adds the curious detail that a little vessel at the side of each mummy contained the remains of nails and hair that had been cut from their bodies. Such was the Spaniards' fear of suppressing heathen ceremonies, alien and even repugnant to the tenets of their own faith, that Manco was allowed to practice certain traditional rites. Cristobal de Molina in 1535 witnessed the great feast known as Inti Raymi to celebrate the harvesting of the maize crop. On this occasion also, the mortuary bundles were paraded and placed under feather awnings. They were attended by many orejones, splendidly attired and wearing medallions of fine gold on their heads. Once again, the ruler's effigies were accompanied by many female attendants, who kept away flies with fans made of swan's feathers. Manco, however, had some unpleasant surprises in store for his Spanish sponsors. He managed to flee from Cusco, was recaptured, but escaped again on the eve of Easter, 1536. His departure heralded the beginning of the Great Rebellion. Manco first led a massive force against the Spanish capital, Lima. This attack was finally repulsed by cavalry. However, following a dramatic siege of Cusco, during which a small group of conquistadors were reduced to the most dire straits, Inca fortunes were gradually reversed with the help of a never-ending flow of reinforcements sent from many parts of Spanish America. Manco eventually took refuge in the far-off province of Vilcabamba, which he ruled as kind of a rump empire until he was murdered in 1545. This realm survived in its remote fastness, ruled successively by the sons of Manco, until it finally succumbed to an expedition sent by the Viceroy Toledo in 1572. The last ruler, the great Tupac Amaru, was condemned to death. Huge crowds of grieving Indians lined the streets of Cusco as the great Tupac Amaru was led to his execution by decapitation. His body was buried in the high chapel of the cathedral. The inevitable triumph. In weighing any possible conclusions that might be drawn from the Civil War, reference has already been made to the reportedly limited attainments of the two claimants to the throne, resulting perhaps from the inadequacies of the process of selection. The Civil War, also seen as arising from a built-in imbalance, occasioned by Huayna Capac's resolve to establish Tumebamba as a second Cusco, and the consequent antagonism between North and South, exposing the ruler to the perils of a counter-revolution on the part of the traditionalist hierarchy of Urin Cusco. From the first stages of the Spanish conquest, as outlined above, certain conclusions may also be drawn concerning the fallen empire. In spite of debilitating internal divisions, the Incas staged a tenacious resistance based on native pride and valor, demonstrating these strengths as much as the weaknesses of their realm. Such resolve on their part is exemplified by the opposition met by the conquistadors in Ecuador. Moreover, Spanish tolerance of Inca rights arose from their reluctance to provoke a population whose reactions they still feared. But in fighting these Spanish, the Incas' greatest limitation may have been the fact that in Indian warfare, ritual considerations were never wholly absent. As Hislop points out, the sources describe rituals and divinations that accompanied almost every step taken before, during, and after military campaigns, including rites performed and offerings made to strengthen Inca efforts and weaken those of the enemy. Favorable auguries were an indispensable prelude to the taking of important initiatives. Ritual considerations were ever present in the savage Civil War, though any tendency to cite that war as the main cause of the empire's destruction is probably exaggerated. Pease expresses doubts as to the degree to which the conflict affected the struggle against the Spanish. In drawing attention to certain aspects of the Civil War, he stresses the fact that Cusco at no point really lost its status as a holy city, the center and the place of origin of the Inca world. But as the adversary of this resurgence of Cusco, the original founders of Inca rule had come from outside the capital, Atahualpa could pose as the new emissary of the sun and even recreate the special role of founder. His miraculous escape from captivity marked the initiation of the conception of Atahualpa as the semi-divine hero receiving the direct aid of his father, the sun. Betanzos, who incidentally rejects the story of Atahualpa's imprisonment in Tumebamba and his miraculous deliverance, offers other examples of his assumed role in Inca ritual as leader of a spiritual renewal. For instance, Atahualpa adopted the curious procedure of causing a bundle to be made of portions of his hair and nails, in conformity with similar bundles that accompanied the mummies of former rulers on ceremonial occasions. Moreover, when proclaimed ruler, he adopted the appellation Gacha Pachacuti Inga Yupangi, because Cacha was the name of the war god associated with his great-grandfather, Pachacutec. Atahualpa thus, in effect, assumed the mantle of that monarch as the new quote-unquote founder. According to Betanzos, it was not Atahualpa but Aguapante, Huascar's general, who was imprisoned by the Cañaris. Atahualpa is at times portrayed as the embodiment of Inca valor, a man who would have reunited and revitalized the empire. However, it remains hard to explain why, following his ruthless treatment of other adversaries, Atahualpa insisted on making an essentially ceremonial occasion of his visit to Pizarro, ensconced in Cajamarca. He led an elaborately caparisoned but lightly armed host of retainers into an obviously dangerous situation, a decision that cost him his kingdom and his life. Surrounded as he was by factious tribes openly disloyal to his cause, such as the Cañaris, he surely had no reason to trust the Spaniards, already known to have ravaged Tumbes and other coastal polities, or to believe that they would simply regale him as the guest of honor in a ceremonial reception. Betanzos, the ruler's own son-in-law, relates in detail how Atahualpa's assembled captains had stressed the base intentions of the invaders and besought him to treat them not as benevolent guests but as inveterate foes, to arm his forces and seek the first chance to cut the Spanish to pieces in the open field. The same chronicler also relates at length a previous conversation between the ruler and Sinquinchara, identified as the messenger who first contacted these Spaniards on their march from the coast. He was obviously a keen observer of Spanish habits and offered perhaps the best proposal as to how to deal with them. Because they tended to sleep in one palace, huddled together, they should be induced to occupy a structure with gates that could be barred at night, after which the building could be burned and its inhabitants incinerated. Unfortunately, Atahualpa was not a good listener when offered such practical suggestions. Hence, in asking the inevitable question of how it was conceivable that this tiny band of Spaniards could overthrow an empire whose forces outnumbered them by perhaps 1,000 to 1, it must be stressed first and foremost that the invaders fought a total war, bent on maintaining the offensive until victory was achieved. Their adversaries, by contrast, fought a different kind of war and were imbued with different concepts, and their conduct of military operations involved ritual and ceremonial considerations wholly irrelevant to victory in the field. At the same time, superior arms and tactics obviously were a very significant factor. In pitched battles, however vast the native armies and however gallant their resistance, the ultimate victory of the Spaniards was assured. One may cite the 4 battles fought on the Spaniards' road to Cusco, as well as the subsequent encounters during their conquest of Ecuador. At best, the Inca forces withdrew and lived to fight another day. Usually they were more successful in ambushing smaller groups of Spaniards than in facing them in the open. The shock caused by strange and fearful arms was no doubt stunning, at least at the outset, and even in subsequent encounters the horses and firearms were often used to good effect. My previous conclusions as to the Spaniards' ability to defeat the Aztecs broadly concur with Hemmings's observations on the triumphs of Spanish conquistadors against the Incas. Our views coincide as to the importance of Spanish armor and the effectiveness of their steel swords. For both Aztecs and Incas, a principal weapon was the club, with a head fitted with sharp spikes. As I pointed out in describing Aztec arms, such clubs had to be lifted on high to inflict a mortal blow, thus exposing the whole body. The Spaniards could dispatch Indian after Indian with lightning sword thrusts before the latter could strike back with their more unwieldy arms. We also reached the same conclusions as to the comparative inefficacy of the arquebus as a decisive arm. At that time it was still a rather clumsy weapon, particularly in wet weather, and also to the limited usefulness of the crossbow, which had already proved inferior to the Welsh longbow at the Battle of Crecy 173 years before the conquest of Mexico. Hemming inclines to the view that Spaniards owed everything to their horses, which gave them mobility and instilled terror into their Inca foes. However, it needs to be borne in mind that Cortés was still able to crush his enemies at the Battle of Otumba after his calamitous retreat from Tenochtitlan, at a time when the Spaniards not only had lost all their artillery, but were left with only 23 extremely debilitated horses. Contrary opinions are expressed by many authors as to the demoralizing effect of the initial belief, reported to have been held both in Mexico and Peru, that the Spaniards were identified with important native deities. However, such convictions were probably a less decisive factor. Hemming suggests that there is little evidence that the eventual outcome was affected by any native identification of the invaders with their returning creator god, Viracocha. This was in effect a replay of the notion that reportedly arose in Mexico, i.e. that the Spaniards personified the creator Quetzalcoatl, a belief that was fairly quickly dispelled. The American Indian empires in both Mexico and Peru were pitted against the greatest soldiers of the age. For a century and a half, no Spanish army was ever defeated in a pitched battle. Perhaps the most vital factor of all, decisive but hard to assess, was their superiority in tactics and morale. The Inca armies fought bravely, but would more easily lose heart if the tide of battle turned against them, whereas the Spaniards positively thrived on adversity and always displayed an absolute resolve to retain the initiative. Saga and substance. Ample data survived from the rather confused 4 decades during which an Inca chief grimly clung to a remote corner of the fallen empire. Such events might prompt a cynic to proclaim that Inca history in the strictest sense, far from ending when the Spaniards arrived, began at that very point. The foregoing brief resume only offers glimpses of a scenario in which some Incas resisted colonial rule, but others backed it to the hilt. Moreover, during this period, not only did Inca fight Inca, but Spaniard fought Spaniard. The record, however convoluted, is nonetheless replete with dates, giving the day and the month of many incidents, together with countless names of leaders who are without question historical figures, and on whose deeds we have fairly precise Spanish records. In contrast, attempts to describe the deeds of the pre-conquest kings in historical terms face greater problems. A major limitation is the sheer brevity of the imperial period as a whole. Rowe assigns a time span of a mere 87 years from the date of Pachacutec's accession to that of Huayna Capac's death. Even those who question this chronology might nonetheless agree that the length of the period of dynastic expansion, assuming that it embraced only 3 reigns, is not very likely to have exceeded a single century. Huayna Capac's end was premature, and Tupac was reportedly still engaged in active warfare in the year of his death. In contrast to these 3 conquerors, of whose deeds many details survive, the sources write of no less than 8 rulers, with the possible exception of Viracocha, whose claim to qualify as historical figures is at best slender. Hence, as we have already seen, the temptation arises to dismiss most of Inca history as mere myth, a tendency backed by the notion that oral accounts are too subjective to be trusted and that without chronology there can be no history. My own conclusion is that at least from the time of Pachacutec onward, the record of the Inca past may in broad terms be treated as history. Because it derives from oral rather than written accounts, the more remote events become progressively blurred, and perhaps disproportionate attention is focused upon Huayna Capac's reign, to a point where even some accounts of Tupac's deeds may reflect acts more strictly attributable to his successor. But in this respect, it may be worth stressing that much of what we know of the Aztecs and their empire, notwithstanding their capacity to record the past, also derives from informants rather than from codices. In particular, the monumental work of Fray Bernardino de Sahagún was recorded in Nahuatl from a carefully chosen band of high-ranking informants. It may be more pertinent to add that even for the history of ancient Greece, a comparable situation arises. Thucydides, perhaps the greatest Greek historian, relied much more on verbal reports than on documents, and did not believe that the past was really discoverable beyond the span covered by oral testimony from living sources. Leopold von Ranke is still probably regarded as the leading historian of the 19th century. He spent his life studying and discovering written sources. In one of the most famous of all pronouncements about the nature of history, he declared that his aim was not to judge but only to tell how it really was. V.S. English gewesen war. But, as M.I. Finney points out, even history based on precise written records is of necessity selective, and Ranke's omissions, as the Italian philosopher Bernardetto Croce insisted, are apparent from his work, together with a certain narrowness of focus. To cite the English historian Lord Acton, all that he, Ranke says, is often true, and yet the whole is untrue. Ranke deceives not by addition but by selection. Yet any tendency to deny historical validity to Inca sources surely derives from this very need for selectivity. In dealing with the Inca Empire, the historian is faced with the absolute necessity of evaluating sources containing conflicting information and deciding which are the more credible. But in questioning the validity of the Inca record, we have to admit that such problems confronted even the very greatest of both ancient and modern historians, Thucydides and Ranke. Inca history is open to challenge on the grounds that it is based on verbal accounts of past traditions, but such accounts should not automatically be branded as unacceptable. One of the most practical ways to check the potential reliability of oral traditions and recollections is to examine those with which one is oneself familiar. I may perhaps, therefore, be forgiven for striking a rather personal note. Because of an unusually long age gap between generations in my own family, I descend from a father born in 1881, whose own father was born in 1840. Apart from many other stories of my grandfather that were more anecdotal, but probably also fairly accurate, I remember being told that his eldest brother, born in 1835, had been severely wounded before the Battle of Sebastopol in the Crimean War at the age of 19, and had died on the harbor on board ship in 1854. Of this event, I have seen absolutely no written record and only quite recently chanced upon documentary proof that the information was correct. Yet the time span involved is much greater than that which elapsed between the traditional dates for Pachacutec's accession and Huayna Capac's death. In assessing the relevance of Inca historical material, archaeology today assumes an ever-increasing role. The findings of scientific research tend to confirm rather than to deny documentary reports as to the extent of Inca conquest in Chile and even in Ecuador. In addition, in recent decades, new evidence has helped us better to define imperial boundaries in Peru, Bolivia, and northwest Argentina. From archaeology, we also learned that the chroniclers' euphoric accounts of elements of the Inca infrastructure, such as the road systems, are far from exaggerated. Obvious limitations. The proper role of archaeology as a means of interpreting and understanding history has admittedly been the subject of much discussion during recent decades. Bruce Trigger even refers to the positively anti-historical bias of the new archaeology. Such research may tend to be viewed as confined more to generalizations about human behavior, with the ultimate goal of defining social systems. Archaeology has been able to contribute substantially to the making of such social definitions in the Andes. But in certain respects, it has surely gone further. In studying the process of not only social but also political change from one horizon to another, it has contributed as well to the history of the late horizon through its affirmation of what preceded it, particularly in the middle horizon. This period began almost a millennium before the Inca era, and its remains, now investigated, bear witness not only to the existence of urban sites, but also to the possible construction of roads. But assuming that meaningful studies of Inca history can indeed be undertaken, it has to be accepted that they have obvious limitations. The dividing line between almost undiluted myth and stories founded on at least an element of fact is at best ill-defined. Our own standards distinguishing between myth and reality are perhaps hard to apply to the Inca world. As Robert Birkhofer points out, in order to determine what is myth, as opposed to what is knowledge, the historian must produce evidence that the actors of the past themselves believed a certain proposition to be real or false. It must be further admitted that it is easier to describe the Inca past in terms of traditional history than in terms of certain contemporary trends in historical research. As described by Gerald Himmelfarb, where the old history features kings, presidents, politicians, the new takes as its subject the anonymous masses. The old history is from above, elitist history, as it is now said. The new is history from below, or populist history. Admittedly, history from below is not altogether lacking. One may cite, for instance, the outstanding work of Mura in unraveling whatever it may be possible to learn from the written records, and even from present-day ethnological data on the anonymous masses, including Mitimays and Llanas. Nonetheless, surviving Inca history, like that of so many pristine realms, is basically history from above. The chroniclers learn from their informants much more about rulers and the ruling class than about the common people. In societies of a certain type, stories of kings and their conquests are what survive for the most part. One may assume that the task of the historian indeed embraces not only the deeds of great men, but also the life of the community. In heroic polities such as that of the Incas, though, the king is the colossus around which the life of the community revolves. The history of ancient peoples further differs from our own in being designed to edify rather than merely to instruct. Precise details, such as which ruler compared which place and when, were often of lesser consequence. More remote events, in particular, become blurred. But here again, the Incas are not unique in such failings. Notwithstanding the use of hieroglyphic writing, the enumeration of the conquests in Asia and the pharaoh Ramses III consists simply of a list of the triumphs of his predecessor. One has only to peruse Spanish eyewitness descriptions of the ceremonial that surrounded the person of Atahualpa, or studied the many chroniclers' accounts of land distribution throughout the empire to appreciate that the Inca was the state. As a form of heroic history, the chroniclers' records tend to focus upon the deeds of the ruler, mainly concentrated in the northernmost marches of the empire during the latter years before the conquest. The record is therefore very incomplete, as we learn little of events occurring in other parts of that huge domain, where the ruler was less often present in person. Information on the upper echelons of the civil administration tends to be fragmentary. Any search for institutional forms and systems of government does not lead us very far. The data on so many aspects of this problem are almost non-existent. Obviously, the monarch had to delegate power to a complex array of officials. Imprecise references occur to a kind of alter ego, or second person to the ruler, but we have little idea as to his functions, though the king's closest relative is sometimes named as governor of Cusco in his absence. The chroniclers write much of the orejones, but little is said of precise functions apart from their command of armies in the field. Surely, though, they must have been responsible for a variety of other aspects of government. Economic data on ancient societies are notoriously hard to unravel, and statistics are usually non-existent. Chronology is in itself a form of statistics and is often the most difficult form to clarify. For instance, some Mesoamerican codices and written sources recorded the passing of the years, but there exists no consensus as to the correlation of the various regional calendrical systems with dates in our calendar. The unique and the recurrent. However imprecise our knowledge of the Incas gleaned from chroniclers' reports, the surviving archaeological remains, whether in the form of infrastructure or monuments, are more than sufficient to demonstrate the magnitude of their achievement. In terms of imperial architecture, one need only cite the best preserved, if not the largest of such remains, the site of Machu Picchu. This clearly was an important Inca town with impressive buildings and fine masonry. It did not stand alone as an isolated outpost, and today it is no longer regarded as a fortress. Bingham's 1915 expedition located and cleared a number of other settlements within a few miles of Machu Picchu. In 1940 and 1941, another major expedition discovered a whole string of towns on the slopes between Ollantaytambo and Machu Picchu, including the sites of Huayna and Intipata, each of which possessed spectacular systems of terracing, greater even than those of Machu Picchu itself. But this whole cluster of sites was situated in a relatively remote corner of their realm. The mind boggles at the potential richness of Inca construction throughout the length and breadth of the empire, in so many places where little has survived. Machu Picchu was merely the last of a string of towns in that remote region, whose flights of superb agriculture terraces were possibly designed to provide special crops and luxuries for the court in Cusco. Notwithstanding in remoteness, Machu Picchu's very survival serves to stress the most unique aspects of the Inca achievement, assuming that many comparable sites indeed existed. It might easily be supposed that the Incas, far from being themselves innovators, merely repeated, on a greatly expanded scale, the innovations of pre-Inca times. But today, leading scholars tend to insist that it is at best half true to treat the Inca Empire as merely having repeated the achievements of the past on a vaster scale. This dramatic process of expansion must have involved radical changes from anything previously accomplished, for instance, in the production of food and in the immensely expanded storage system. One wonders what the Incas might have accomplished if their empire had endured, like that of Timor, for centuries. As Teresa Topic stresses, moreover, the vast difference in scale between Inca and Chimu storage facilities in itself illustrates fundamental differences between their overall achievements, in particular between Inca and Chimu state finances. One may further stress that by its very size, apart from other considerations, the Inca domain was an intricate structure that achieved a delicate balance, but that inevitably collapsed in the hands of new masters who had no experience of such a structure or of Andean conditions in general. In recent decades, a tendency has prevailed to seek a nomothetic approach to human culture as governed by definable laws and to establish models that might serve as a norm for predicting a given pattern of change. Such notions tend to be questioned by some authors. One may again cite Bruce Trigger as insisting that there is no quick and easy way by which archaeologists can create a body of evolutionary theory that will allow them simultaneously to predict or predict backwards, the course of history. Notwithstanding such reservations, probably few scholars today would reject out of hand the potential use of models, especially where there are ample examples of a comparable set of circumstances. Nomothetic concepts may, for instance, help to clarify differences and similarities between the progress of certain nations following the inception of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. Generalizations of another kind may be applicable to smaller chieftainships in earlier times throughout the globe. But history is the study of both the unique and the recurrent. Formation of major empires involving the subjection by one conquest state of a whole series of peoples over an extensive area is a rare phenomenon. The number of instances is perhaps rather small to allow for the establishment of any standard that might serve as a norm for the development of others. At best, one may propose tentative generalizations. If we divide these conquest states into maritime empires such as the Spanish and British, and contiguous land-based empires in which conquering armies simply subjected many neighboring peoples to their rule, the number of comparable instances becomes even smaller. Though certain aspects of history of other empires may be relevant to the Inca case, there surely exists no model that bears strict comparison, given the territory's daunting ecological circumstances. The only Asian mountain range comparable to the Andes, the Himalayas, served more as a dividing line between cultures. The reasons why. In the absence of obvious physical parallels and of any kind of detailed knowledge of the Incas' pre-imperial past, it remains hard to explain why they, rather than some other group, became the dominant power of their era. As Conrad and Damaris observe, had there been a bookmaker in 1430 taking bets as to who would control the southern Sierra in the near future, he would probably have established two peoples as odds-on favorites. The top contender would have been the Lupaca, who had become the strongest kingdom in the rich Titicaca Basin through their victory over the Colas. The other choice would have been the Chancas, who in a startling turn of events had completely upset the balance of power north and west of Cusco after defeating their traditional enemies, the Quechuas. In the absence of a more concise explanation, one might only observe that the Incas, apart from their martial skills indispensable for any would-be conqueror, also displayed notable political talents not shared by all their neighbors. The turning point in their history, the defeat of the Chancas, was accomplished largely through their ability to form a kind of coalition, enabling them to achieve victory against considerable odds. They also consistently demonstrated a certain political acumen in their ability to conciliate many conquered peoples. For instance, Colas or Charcas were willing to march vast distances and to fight and die to further the process of Inca conquest. Explanations as to why a given group may succeed in establishing control over its late neighbors, whether in the Old World or the New, are seldom easy to formulate. The factors that motivated a few such groups to go much farther and to make long-range conquests are even harder to determine. In studying the forces that motivated both the Inca and the Aztec empires, Conrad and Damaris propose first and foremost religious or ideological factors for a process that eventually led to overexpansion. They suggest that for the Mexicas, the sacrificial cult became a driving force in generating expansionist policies. For the Incas, the elaboration of the royal ancestor cult, with its crucial extension of a king's property rights beyond his demise, created an institutional imbalance in the dynastic system, virtually imposing expansionistic policies on each heir to the throne. Split inheritance thus ensured the militarism of the Inca states as rulers, and the dogma of Inti gave those rulers the justification and propaganda they needed to carry out imperialist policies. Split inheritance thus ensured the militarism of the Inca states rulers, and the dogma of Inti gave those rulers the justification and propaganda they needed to carry out imperialist policies. Conrad and Damaris conclude, "We are convinced that ideological elements were the cutting edge of Mexica and Inca imperialism." It may, however, be fair to add that the two authors insist that the processes involved in both imperial expansions are extremely complex and that care must be taken to refrain from proposing a purely monocasual explanation. It may indeed be generally accepted that the Incas solarized the Andean creator god, thereby forging an instrument of imperial conquest that took formal shape in the sun temples built throughout their realm. However, in the Inca creation myth, the creator is inseparable from the sun from the very beginning. The myth offers an interpretation of Viracocha as an agent of the sun. The creator deity, however, was already basic to the pantheon of many of the conquered peoples. Hence, this form of religious manipulation may have served admirably as an instrument of domination, but it hardly amounted to any new ideology, as compared, say, to the fanatical determination of Islamic conquerors to impose on others an absolutely distinct faith. The case of the Mexicas is perhaps comparable to that of the Incas. Ostensibly, Huitzilopochtli was their tutelary deity, yet so profound was their veneration for Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, that it becomes hard to determine which of the two ranked as the senior god. Tezcatlipoca, who had evolved from the original feline god of Mesoamerica, was in one form or another universally revered, whereas Huitzilopochtli was virtually an alter ego of the god Camaxtli, closely linked with Mixcoatl, another deity whose cult was very widespread. It is hard to insist that the Mexicas made war simply to convert people to gods whom they already worshipped in one form or another. Split inheritance may indeed have provided a motive for Inca expansion, though it is far from clear, as we have seen, how far the Inca rulers established personal holdings, as opposed to state lands, in theory, belonging to the Incas in distant provinces. The truly royal and Panaca constructions in estates near Cusco far exceeded in their magnificence and elegance any state settlements beyond the Cusco region. As an alternative or supplement to ideology, the most obvious incentive for wars of conquest is surely the quest for material gain, whether in the form of land, trade, or mere booty. Though the Incas were ostensibly reluctant traders, state control not only of land in conquered provinces, but also of the local labor force, yielded a massive surplus of agricultural produce and other goods. Much of this was stored locally, partly for military use, though a large proportion of the sumptuary items, particularly gold, was dispatched to Cusco. The ruling elite of Cusco seemingly developed a veritable passion for amassing immense quantities, far beyond any rational requirements of such tribute, much of which was then simply hoarded. In discussing motivation, it may therefore be relevant to stress once again the phenomenon of accumulated spoils. Nothing had prepared these Spaniards for the gigantic stores found in Cusco. According to Pedro Sancho, the quantities are so vast that it was hard to imagine how the natives can ever have paid such enormous tribute consisting of so many items. These stores included whole buildings full of utilitarian things such as cloaks, wool, metal, and cloth. But what most struck the conquistadors was the accumulation of smaller items of exquisite quality simply stored in leather chests. They included deposits of iridescent hummingbird feathers, each little larger than a fingernail. These were threaded together and made into garments that contained staggering amounts of such iridescence. Many other hoards of feathers were found, a kind used for robes worn at the great festivals. Needless to say, such finery was of scant interest to these Spaniards, who were consumed with the urge to acquire pure gold and melted down countless treasures for this purpose. In previous chapters, the temptation to draw conclusions between the Inca and Aztec empires has been greatly avoided. However, given that both empires met the same ultimate fate, dramatically collapsing when confronted with small contingents of Spanish conquistadors, the parallels are surely close enough to merit attention, notwithstanding certain marked differences. Once they had defeated their enemies, the Aztecs virtually left local rulers in full charge of their former domains, subject only to the obligation to make fairly onerous tribute payments every 80 days, payments strictly supervised by imperial officials. Detailed documentary evidence survives of the exact quantity of each item extracted from a given province. The Aztecs, like the Incas, did have an effective system of military recruitment, and both states were remarkably successful in mobilizing levies from conquered peoples to fight their battles. However, the Aztecs' more loosened domain offers a striking contrast to the Inca Empire, over whose Caracas provincial governors exercised tight control. The imposing infrastructure, including the road network and the storage facilities, has no true counterpart in Mesoamerica. Ironically, perhaps in view of their patent dissimilarities, in the two New World empires conquered by the Spanish, a comparable phenomenon seems to have arisen. For both, a powerful factor in the process of continuous expansion was the urge to acquire ever-increasing supplies of sumptuary objects. Many were sent from provinces so far distant that it was hardly feasible to haul the more bulky goods to the capital for general consumption, notwithstanding in the case of the Incas, the fine road network. Such sumptuary goods, including much of those used to reward the elites of Cusco and of Tenochtitlan, served basically ritual purposes. These rituals, celebrated on an ever more stupendous scale, are amply described by Sahagún and other Aztec chroniclers. Spaniards witnessed Inca rites of comparable splendor in the early post-conquest years. Hence, for both Aztecs and Incas, spiritual and material motives for conquest were inextricably linked, as part of the need to satisfy an appetite for luxury products. If these also helped to enrich the privileged few, such redistribution served basically ceremonial ends. Immense efforts were, of course, also made to reinforce the economy of the core regions of the Valley of Mexico and the Valley of Cusco by massive public works. In both instances, spectacular results were brought about. However, it becomes hard to see the process of long-range expansion as contributing in a very direct manner to such achievements, for which conquest on a much less ambitious scale might have provided an adequate surplus of materials and manpower. Nonetheless, the Incas placed much emphasis on the quest for more gold. In addition, vast quantities of trophies, fashioned from such exotic components as feathers from the breasts of hummingbirds, were found by the conquistadors in Cusco. The Codex Mendoza lists the tribute supplied to the Aztecs by the province of Soconusco, on the border of present-day Guatemala. Bunches of feathers predominate, including those taken from the tails of the quetzal bird, native to that region. In both empires, such items became as much a necessity as a luxury. They were required for the ever more elaborate rituals, which were viewed as indispensable for the honoring of the gods, for the ordering of the cosmos, and for the well-being of the rulers of the two empires and of their elite hierarchies. Conrad, who tends to reject pure cultural materialism as an adequate explanation for the expansion of both the Chimu and Inca empires, draws attention, in writing of split inheritance, to the massive ceremonial attached to the mummies of past rulers, maintained in state, consulted in times of stress, and brought out to attend important rites. The existence of this whole series of establishments of defunct Inca rulers surely magnified the demand for ceremonial paraphernalia from remote provinces, even if those territories did not serve to provide the Panakas with additional estates. It may be fair to suggest that the process of endless expansion had slackened some years before the Spaniards arrived. Moctezuma II made little attempt to expand his realm beyond the limits reached by his all-conquering predecessor, Huitzilopochtli. He concentrated his efforts on consolidation and on the attempt to suppress enclaves within his empire that retained a measure of independence. Equally, following Tupac's dazzling career of conquest, Huayna Capac seemingly made less spectacular advances, even refraining from attempts to gain control of the Ecuadorian littoral. It should be added that for the Aztecs, for example, in the case of the Oaxaca Valley, and to a much greater extent for the Incas, distant provinces were not treated solely as suppliers of sumptuary goods. Much of the labor and its produce throughout the Inca realm was dedicated to the maintenance of the local infrastructure. Of this, the Valley of Cochabamba may serve as an example. As we have already seen, the sources report the massive introduction of minimes by Huayna Capac, a measure that served to greatly augment the output of non-luxury produce and to make of this valley a veritable breadbasket that served to support the Inca power structure in the southern part of the empire. Other causes may also be cited that impel certain peoples to embark on a career of conquest, apart from the ideological and material motives discussed above. Of these, perhaps the most significant factor is that once a given polity begins to conquer others, there is no obvious place to stop. It becomes very hard to set any limit to the process, even when faced with diminishing returns. Though precise models for empire building may be elusive, many other worlds' greatest empires seem to have displayed this compulsive tendency toward overexpansion, leading the conquerors to press ever forward, almost blindly, regardless of the cost in blood and resources, before initiating a process of consolidation. This was often hard to achieve after expansion had been carried so far. The British Empire might be cited as an example, though it may be an oversimplification to say that the empire was one in a fit of absent-mindedness. It would be hard to describe the process as motivated by a set ideology. To India in particular, the British originally were not to impose dogma but to earn profits. For a century and a half, they clung to their status as humble petitioners of a Mughal emperor and his viceroys. They were servants not of the English monarch, but of the East India Company of London, governed by a board of directors. They in turn were chosen by shareholders who sought dividends rather than domains and who were opposed to military involvement. But in the long term, the British had little alternative but to impose direct rule on province after province in order to protect that trade. This initially protective approach became an imperative. Clive's decisive victory at Plassey in 1757 over forces backed by the French marked the outset of an inexorable process of conquest. Dominion, once acquired, as a final resort, can only be defined by gaining yet more dominion. By the second half of the 19th century, British expansionism had gained a momentum of its own, resulting in a vast but somewhat purposeless acquisition of countless other territories, large and small, throughout the globe. Conrad and Damaris may be accurate in insisting that both the Inca and the Aztec empires became overextended. As the authors imply, such expansion may surely be seen as having developed a momentum of its own, offering little in terms of any corresponding material or spiritual rewards. The Ecuadorian campaigns, reportedly involving crippling losses, convulsed the whole fabric of empire and upset its equilibrium. As we have already seen, incentives for northern conquest were few. Solomon points to the favorable conditions prevailing in highland Ecuador for the cultivation of maize, and to the possible mystical religious significance for the Incas of its situation on the equatorial line, but he agrees that such incentives hardly compensated for the price in terms of blood and resources. Inca southward expansion, though less fully documented, might be viewed in almost similar terms. The resistance of the natives to any form of alien rule eventually may have almost borne comparison to the ferocity of those of Ecuador. The Incas encountered implacable opposition before some kind of border was established in central Chile. The Spaniards were to face comparable resistance. The Araucanians were among the first American Indians to adopt the horse, and in 1598 300 mounted warriors annihilated a Spanish force of comparable strength. In the extreme south, they held out for centuries against the Spanish and subsequently against the forces of the Chilean Republic, to whom they only finally surrendered their freedom in the 1890s. The distances involved in advancing into central Chile were so immense that, were it not for archaeological proof of an Inca presence, some scholars might be tempted to dismiss reports of such feats as mere fables. As we have already seen, the ostensible attraction of Chile was its mining resources, but the Incas could have extracted similar or larger quantities of metal from mines much nearer home. The first Spaniards to arrive in the Potosi region of Bolivia were surprised to note that the Incas extracted metal only during the warmer months of the year. It was left to the conquerors to greatly intensify work in existing mines, apart from the vastly more productive silver mines that they were quick to discover. According to John Berthelot, scouts sent by Pizarro in 1533 were told that at the Chuquiago mines in Bolivia, a mere 50 men and women were employed, at times even fewer. At another center, Carabaya, the mines were merely worked in the summer when their fields did not require the Indians' presence. Hence, in seeking motives for imperial expansion, sheer greed, in terms of the search for ever greater material wealth, surely played its part, but can hardly be viewed as a sole determinative goal. Perhaps a compulsive tendency to indulge in overexpansion applied as much to the Incas as to other empires. Solomon, in writing of Ecuador, describes the forward momentum of the Inca frontier as a precondition to the pacification of areas farther to the rear. Such expansion often involving immense costs, as in the Imbabura area, in which the epic battle of Yahuacocha was fought, and in Chile, was the price of consolidating military efforts already expended. The alternative, the hermetic sealing off of a static boundary, does not seem to have been attempted. An untimely end. Of the tale of doom and disaster that thus befell the Inca Empire when confronted with invaders from another world, poignant details survive. In some respects, the Inca collapse followed the Aztec pattern a decade earlier. In others, the course of events differed. In particular, the pitiful and parallel fates of their respective rulers have been recounted and reenacted in every detail. Improbable versions of their small talk have been confected to enrich the dialogue of dramas, novels, motion pictures, and even operas inspired by their misfortunes. One may concur that these empires, having enjoyed a similar lifespan, were facing comparable problems at the time they were overthrown. However, the premise that even if no Spanish invasion had occurred, their days were numbered is surely more open to question. The Incas' capability for long-term survival, if no such invasion had taken place, may be a strictly hypothetical subject. It is nonetheless relevant, as it poses the fundamental question as to whether their achievement in terms of human history represented an advance over what had gone before the Central Andes, or whether it was nothing but a passing phenomenon, a bubble that was soon to be burst in any event. Every empire inevitably must have an end as well as a beginning. In Arnold Toynbee's terminology, familiar to all historians, civilizations ultimately engender universal states, subject to a somewhat predictable but fairly long, drawn-out process of rise and fall. It may be worth adding that most Old World empires did enjoy a fairly prolonged lifespan. To cite one example, Joseph Vogt writes of the existence of a state of crisis in the ancient world ruled by Rome in about AD 200. By the time Diocletian became emperor in AD 284, Vogt claims the situation was desperate. But that empire endured for yet another 2 centuries before the last emperor was deposed by the Goths in AD 476. Meanwhile, the empire of the New or Second Rome, Constantinople, survived for almost another 1,000 years, until it was overthrown in AD 1453 by the Turks. Their empire, in its turn, was to live on into our own century. As I have proposed in another context, it is hard to say whether the Aztecs could have overcome the problems of overexpansion if no Spaniards had arrived. But estimates of the potential lifespan of such empires often fail to take into account another factor. Their trajectory does not always follow a consistent curve. Established empires may have their ups and downs, enjoying more than one peak period of power before the ultimate collapse. Of this, I propose Assyria as an example. After the 13th century BC, Assyria had conquered the Babylonian Empire. After succumbing once more to Babylon two centuries later, Assyria acquired in the 8th and 9th centuries BC an empire more extensive than the first. Though predicting the possible future of an Inca Empire that was spared the Spanish onslaught is obviously a speculative exercise, it is surely worth suggesting that any survival of Inca power need not automatically presuppose the maintenance of the notably elongated domain of 1532. After the conclusion of the Civil War, the situation in Ecuador might have become stabilized, at a time when the Chilean frontier region was apparently also more settled. But given the unwieldy proportions of an empire stretching from northern Ecuador to central Chile, it is surely not inconceivable that, at one end or the other of this extended line of provinces, some territory could eventually have been yielded without any calamitous effect on the economic or political stability of the whole fabric. Though the tendency toward a disputed succession may have been the Achilles heel of the Inca Empire, in other respects, such as the massive infrastructure and the well-established systems of control, it was held together by certain bonds, not altogether shared by the Aztec realm, that endowed it within its strength. Many of the subject peoples, though they had lost their independence, were perhaps not wholly unmindful of benefits derived from the infrastructure created by the empire, which served to increase the production of food and raw materials, part of which were used locally. Given the Incas' fairly stubborn resistance to the Spaniards, which lasted for decades before it was finally extinguished, they could surely have faced up to any sporadic uprisings among their own conquered peoples almost indefinitely if the Europeans had not arrived. Aside from any such speculation as to its inherent solidity, the Inca realm was without question a stupendous achievement, deserving to rank high in the annals of empire building throughout the world. Its memory survives not as an over-romanticized enigma, but as a supreme triumph of human genius over the challenge of some of the harshest conditions to be found on our planet. This concludes this chapter and this book.